Gets on just yet. Okay, for everybody who is at home, we are at the Chartiers-Houston Community Library. We're getting started. It's 1 o'clock, so we are getting started with our Bigfoot event. We have here Doug Waller. He is an author and Bigfoot investigator, and he has brought some casts for us and some pictures, and he's got a great presentation for us to get started. So take it away, Doug.
Thank you. My name is Doug Waller, and I'm with the Southeastern Ohio Society for Bigfoot Investigations. We're located over by Cambridge in Jersey County, and I actually live in Muskingum myself. Okay, Bigfoot. The subject of Bigfoot raises lots of questions. What is Bigfoot? Is he an undiscovered ape? A race of giants? Is he an extraterrestrial? Is Bigfoot the missing link? Well, Native Americans were the first to see these creatures, as is evidenced by their cave drawings and totem poles. The earliest written report of Bigfoot that we have been able to find is from the writings of Leif Erikson in 986 AD, when the Norseman made his first trip to the New World. And they discovered, and they called them Skelring, which loosely translates into barbarian. Now, for a long-haired, barrel-chested Viking to call something else a barbarian, they must have really been a sight to behold. The first sighting of Bigfoot creatures in Ohio was in Gallia County, which is where Gallipolis is, down January 26, 1869, a newspaper report talked about a man and his daughter in a horse-drawn carriage encountering one of these creatures along. The creature and the man ended up on the ground fighting, and the creature was getting the best of the man. The daughter got out of the wagon and threw a rock, striking the beast in the head, which it retreated into the thicket. Now, the BFRO, Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, you can go on their website and access their database of sighting reports across the United States and Canada. And currently, Ohio, which is where we're from, is ranked number 4. It was 5, and it's surpassed, I think it was Illinois. It's in the number 4 position. Well, every state in the Union has reports of these creatures being seen, except some people even argue that there are some stories coming out of the islands of creatures, but that remains to be seen. But all of Canada has had these reports of the United States except for Hawaii. Now, under behaviors and intimidation tactics, some of the things that Bigfoot will do if you were to encounter one out in the woods and they want to be left alone and want you to vacate the area, some of the things that they might do to get you to leave would be screaming. They use wood knocks to communicate with one, like a ball bat on a tree or a tree branch hitting another tree. And we think that's one form of communication they have to talk to one another. But to get you to leave, they may scream, they may throw rocks, they'll shake trees. People sometimes report a very horrible odor that they've said reminded them of wet dog, rotten eggs, feces, urine, a skunk, and it was extremely powerful. Other people don't report any smell whatsoever, so we think that the creatures are able to produce this at will, something like a skunk might do. You know, should you get too close and they want you to leave, they could spread. Slapping, back that up a minute. Slapping or pounding on houses. Some people report chatter, growling, whistles, grunts. Paralleling, what that is People report sometimes they'll be walking through the woods and they hear footsteps off to their side. They stop and turn and look to try to see what it is. The footsteps also stop. They'll start back up and the footsteps. And we think it's just an intimidation of the book. I put this in here. Sometimes we'll take in a report over the phone from someone who's had an unusual thing happen around their residence, or maybe even seen a Bigfoot. I question the person about different things that might have occurred to substantiate their claims of an actual Bigfoot being responsible for what occurred. Now, these are some of the things they've reported to me. They've had the feeling of being watched. The hair on the back of their neck or arms was standing up. The woods or immediate vicinity became deadly quiet with no animal, bird, or sometimes even insect sounds. A very strong, awful stench as powerful as a skunk, but smelling more like dead animals, sewer, rotten eggs, species, or a combination of these. Eyes shine, looking back at them from the woods, or in through a window at the residence. Large shadows or silhouettes seen around the yard or residence. Heavy breathing outside of their window. Noises such as grunts, growls, screams, yells, or a foreign language. Noises and whistles. A strange gibberish-like chattering sound resembling a foreign language. Sticks, trees, and brush-breaking noises. Wood knocks, rock clacking, stones, pebbles, pine cones being thrown. Sounds of something very heavy walking around. It will take DNA evidence or a body to prove the existence of Bigfoot. Why no bones or body? That's one of the questions that we get a lot. People say, well, I would be more apt to believe in these creatures, or at least a skeleton or a skull or something. How come we don't have that? Well, as far as the bones, when an animal dies out in the woods, it doesn't take very long for these bones to, everything to disappear on the animal, from possums and coyotes and raccoons and vultures and crows will eat the body. Rodents will consume the bones. Another theory is that they bury their dead. There have been some stories in some of the books that I've read where they claim to have seen Bigfoot burying dead individuals. Another theory is that they eat their dead. There's another theory that Bigfoot's possibly like an elephant. If it's old and it knows its days are numbered and it's sickly or weak, sometimes they'll retreat into the furthest reaches of the forest to die, where their body, it's just not discovered anymore. Another theory is that it's a government cover-up. There have been bodies supposedly found, and the military or some government entity comes in, takes the body away, and everyone's sworn to secrecy, and that's the end of it. Well, how many Bigfoots are there in the world? Well, that's a good question. And in my reading, I have seen authors come up with numbers, and I have no real idea how they can come up with these figures, because it's anybody's guess. There is a viable population, breeding population of these creatures, because we do have, one piece of evidence, as noted on our table over here with the track cast, you'll see there are large individuals, some of them in the range of 18, 20 inches, clear down to smaller casts, indicating that there are juveniles. There have been sightings of juveniles. So there are enough of them to keep the species going. They do reproduce. But as far as how many, I don't know. Some areas of the country seem to have a lot more sightings than others. For instance, Ohio, on our sightings map that we brought today, if you see the eastern half of Ohio, you see several pink dots indicating there have been many, many more reports in the eastern part of the state than the western part. Well, the western part of Ohio was flat. When the glacier came down through, it kind of shaved it clean. And so there are more places in the eastern half of Ohio for these creatures to stay hidden, you know, in caves and crevices and rock outcroppings. So that's one reason for that. So we don't really, you know, I hesitate to even guess as to how many there are, if not thousands, at least hundreds across the United States. Well, where are Bigfoot seen? Well, of course, rural areas. Sometimes people report these along forests, you know, if they're hiking or hunting or walking in the woods or whatever. But we also get reports from residential areas as well, inside city limits. Now, I mentioned we're from the Cambridge area. We've actually got 3 or 4 reports from right inside the city limits of Cambridge. As people were driving along the interstate, if you look on the left side of the screen, there's a bridge right along Interstate 70 where a woman and her father were driving past in a Class C motorhome on their way to Salt Fork, and they looked out to the right side windows and saw Bigfoot walking up the railroad tracks. And Shauna and I went and investigated that, and the witnesses claimed that the shoulders on the creature were as wide as what the rails were apart. So it was a pretty good sized creature that they sighted. Muirfield Village in Dublin, Ohio, when they were building the golf course back in the 70s, there were several reports of the security guards seeing these creatures out on the golf course at night. And they put their foot down and said, we're not going to work until we have guns and ammunition because we're afraid to be out there around these creatures. And this is something that you can actually go onto the BFRO website and check out the different sighting reports, and you'll find a couple of reports from this very incident. Other places Bigfoot are sometimes seen. Well, along power line right-of-ways. Sometimes if you're driving along, you cross a railroad track or go across the bridge or there's a power line right-of-way, just cast a quick glance off to the side. You might be lucky. That's how a lot of my reports come to me, you know, in the stories that I put in my books. People that just happen to catch a glimpse of one of these creatures. Well, what do they look like? Well, this is a still from the famous Patterson-Gimlin film from Bluff Creek, California, 1967. What we're going to show you now, these are actually some sketches and drawings by some of the artists in the Bigfoot field. A very realistic looking drawing. I'm not sure whether that was Sibylla Irwin or not, but she's one of the better artists out there. But some of the other ones, including some of them that have come to me from the actual eyewitnesses, we'll show next. This is a drawing of a juvenile creature that a man named Don Nicely saw at the Endley Road area of Salt Fork State Park. And Don's story is in one of my books. I think it's my 4th book, possibly. This was a juvenile creature. He was fishing. It was actually a little bit after dark when he saw the creature, but he'd been there since before the sun had gone down and had been hearing noises coming from the woods. But he saw this creature after dark, and it walked right past him along the shoreline. And he didn't get a picture, but he was able to do a sketch of the creature. The next one is from a sketch of a creature drawn by witness Donna Ruth, and this was from the Norris Lake, Tennessee area. And this is Donna's rendition of what she saw, and her story is in, I think, my 3rd book. Now these are from the books of David Paulides. Before he started writing the Missing 411 books, he did 2 Bigfoot books. The Hoopa Project and Tribal Bigfoot. Now, David has a law enforcement background, and he was invited to Northern California to go to the Hoopa Indian Reservation, and he got permission to interview some of the eyewitnesses that had seen these creatures and get their stories. He took a fellow with him named Harvey Pratt, and Mr. Pratt was a sketch artist for the police department or sheriff's office. So as David would sit down and get the story from the witness, Harvey would ask them what the creature that they saw looked like. And these are some of the finished products. And if you look at some of these, some look very ape or gorilla-like, whereas other ones look human-like. Here's one, a sketch by Sibylla Irwin, and I believe that's the one that Dave Groves saw in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania when he was riding an ATV. So Sibylla worked with Mr. Groves, this is it. Sibylla worked with Mr. Groves and got down from memory what he had seen, and this is what the creature looked like. Artwork by the eyewitness. This is a sketch of a creature that Lorena Cunningham saw back in Ohio in Noble County. This was in 1984. She had a daytime sighting in a little town called Sharon. It's in Noble County, and it's just south of Cambridge a little bit. She and her 3 children were at the playground of an old school that I guess the Grange Hall owns it now. And they had a daytime sighting of a female creature that was apparently attracted by the giggling and happy sounds that Lorena's kids were making when they were playing on this equipment. And the creature came right up close to the children and Lorena, and of course scared the bejeebers out of Lorena. She thought, you know, they were all doomed. But she described the different expressions on the creature's face, and she said the creature was actually smiling and enjoying the moment. You know, it was really getting a kick out of watching the kids play. But that's Lorena's sketch, and Lorena actually had a second sighting some 20 years later of a different creature, and this is the doll that was the one that she had seen in 1984, but she had a second sighting of one in 2004, and it was built differently. It was tall and lanky, built more like a basketball player than a 7.5-foot, you know, linebacker type body. Well, Bigfoot come in various colors: white, reddish brown, black, gray, salt and pepper color. Here's some examples. You see we had a female there. You can actually see the breast on it. Some people report that. As I said, Lorena saw a female at the playground. Well, some of the information, the good sources of information to get caught up on Bigfoot comes from books. I tend to rely more on a printed book than I do stuff off of the internet. You can run into some very dubious material on the internet. Not all of it is, of course, but do like I did. Go to the library and ask for Bigfoot books, you know, and if they don't have anything on the shelf, see if they can get something through their interlibrary loan system. Since I got interested in Bigfoot and started doing this, I've read in the neighborhoods of 200 different books, which doesn't qualify me as being an expert on the subject, because there is no such thing as a Bigfoot expert, but there's an awful lot of good material out there. And as you can see, I've written 5 books on the subject now, and what that means is there's a lot of stories out there. When I give these Bigfoot talks, today we don't have an audience, but usually there are people in the audience, and quite often afterwards they'll come up and tell me of something that's happened to them, something they saw. And so I'll try to get their contact information and get a hold of them. And, you know, sometimes that leads to another book coming up, so we'll see if that happens again. Websites and Facebook pages that are good sources of information would include the BFRO.net, SOSFI, now that's the acronym for the Southeastern Ohio Society for Bigfoot Investigations. We have a Facebook page. A couple other sources you might want to check out are StanCourtney.com. He's a Bigfoot researcher from Illinois, and he has a very large database of sounds that people have sent him, and plus some of them he's recorded himself through digital recorders. A lot of them are known animals that you can compare to what you might have heard. Some of them supposedly are Bigfoot sounds. And Ohio Bigfoot Hunters is another one that you might want to check out. Well, how big do they get? Well, they come in all different sizes, as we said, from juveniles, infants, little ones, clear up to 10, 12 foot. I know there have been some reports in some of the books that I've read of creatures even in the 15-foot range. Now that's awfully big. I don't know if that's possible, but a lot of, you know, I didn't know if Bigfoot being real was possible until I got into this. But usually we hear of an adult creature being in the neighborhood of 7 to 8 feet, sometimes a little bigger, but who knows how big they can get. Bigfoot have been reported being anywhere from 7 to 10 feet. Juveniles and family units have also been seen. Some of the reports I've taken do indicate that there was sometimes 2, 3, and maybe even 4 creatures seen together at one time. Well, what does Bigfoot eat? Well, Bigfoot is omnivorous. He'll eat meat, he'll eat vegetables. He won't hesitate at dumpster diving if he thinks there's something in there. There have been reports of the creatures eating dead animals along the road. They are very adept at finding fruit trees that have ripe fruit. They'll come in overnight and pick every apple off the tree as far as they can get it. They've raided gardens. People have said that they had like a refrigerator and a freezer out on their back porch, and they had stuff in there. And the next morning they might walk out and there the door is standing open and the food was gone. And it was something that required either a person or an animal with hands to open the latch. You know, it's like a raccoon couldn't open this, grab this handle and open the big door and take all the food out of there. So they're very opportunistic. Okay, are Bigfoot dangerous? Well, as I mentioned, David Paulides, he also writes these missing 411 books that are very popular. I don't know how many he's got out at this time, maybe 6 or 7. But some people tend to think that a lot of these missing persons were abducted by Bigfoot creatures in the books. You'll just have to read the books and make your own decision on this. There is a story in a book called The Wilderness Hunter by Theodore Roosevelt of a couple of trappers way back in the, I think it was in the early 1900s, and one of the trappers ended up losing his life. And if you read the story, it sounds as if they were visited, their campsite was visited by a Bigfoot creature on a number of occasions. And when they finally realized what they were dealing with and decided that they had to get out of the area, the 2 men split up briefly to finish pulling their traps. And one of the men was killed by something that had broken his neck and broke bones in his body, and they found these big tracks around there. So Bigfoot was the culprit in that incident. The 8 canyon attack. This was another story from the 1920s near Mount St. Helens. This story is easy to access. Plenty of Bigfoot books have this, or you could read about it online. But these prospectors were attacked in their cabin at night, and the creatures were hurling big stones and boulders on the roof of the cabin, and the men survived through the night, and they fled the next morning. Okay, tracks. This is a picture of a track that I took the picture actually. This is from the Ringer property in Guernsey County, Knox Township, in January of 2007. This is a picture of the trackway, and if you look at the yellow arrows, it indicates the first step, the second step, the third step, the fourth step being up here. But you'll notice they're in like a straight, straight line pattern, like a girl on a balance beam, or one of the Walendas when they walk on the high wire. It's 1 foot in front of the other. Now, typically when we find Bigfoot tracks, which isn't very often, but when we do, that's the pattern that they leave, rather than a staggered left, right, like a human will leave. Now, these particular tracks were some 19 to 20 inches long, the footprints, and it was, I believe it was 54 inches from the toe of this lower track to the heel of the one out in front of it. So that's a pretty good size stride. And I tried to duplicate that. I'm 6'2", and I had to jump, and I was able to do 1 or 2, and then I fell down in the snow. Another track, this is also from Guernsey County. Actually, it wasn't very far from the Ringer property, maybe 5 miles is the way the crow flies, but it was 2012. And it was a much smaller foot, so we know it wasn't the same creature. These tracks were about 12.5 inches long. This is about a 14-inch track that we found at Salt Fork State Park. We didn't have our tape measure with us, so put the old dollar bill down, and that's roughly 6 inches long. And you can see this was a right foot, and you can see the toes up here. This isn't our picture, but it's one that we found online. This is from a juvenile track near Clendenning Lake in Ohio. This would be north of the Salt Fork area. But everybody knows how small a Bic lighter is. And so this was just a young one. Undoubtedly it was traveling with its mother or father, because I think, as the story said, there was a set of adult tracks with this one, but I just showed you that there are small ones out there. The Shipton Yeti track, we actually have a copy of that. I don't think we have it here today. Yeah, on the end here. That was from the Himalayan Mountains in 1951. Now, of course, ours is just a copy. But these creatures, or some type of undiscovered primate, have been seen on every continent on Earth except Antarctica. Okay, other forms of evidence that we found: tree twists, these pinwheel structures, nests. Okay, eyewitness reports. Now, these are some of the stories that I've taken, and I've put them in my book. So the first one we'll talk about is the Greg Clark property, Guernsey County. This man was bowling in January of 2012. Somebody asked him if he had any firewood to sell, and he said, "I'll check when I get home." When he got to his home that evening, he found all these tracks in the snow in the backyard. There were literally dozens of them, apparently all from the same creature. Now, if you leave it on there for a second, this shows that straight inline pattern again, and I think Greg said that they were about 3 feet apart for the most part, there was a section where it was further, where it indicated the creature started running faster. But he would throw corn out for deer and birds and stuff. And he said any evening he had several deer out there eating the corn. And he thinks that this Bigfoot happened upon, the deer, and he's trying to run down a deer and catch one and eat the deer. But there was no evidence of it having been successful. But the thing chased these deer all over the back 40. It went down across the creek, into the water, and back up out 2 or 3 times. But that was, as I said, maybe 5 miles from the Ringer property. This was right along Route 209, just west of Cambridge. And this is Mr. Clark trying to step off how far apart it was from one track to the next. The Orm Avenue Bigfoot sighting, this took place New Year's Eve on 2006. I went to the hardware store in Cambridge one day to buy something, and I had a Bigfoot hat on, and the girl at the counter asked me about my hat, and she says, "Do you wear that as a joke?" And I says, "No." She says, "Then you believe in Bigfoot?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, I saw one and no one will believe me." So I gave her one of my cards and I said, I'll hear your story. You send me an email or call me and we'll talk. So she talked to me and said that it was New Year's Eve in 2006, and her parents were out at a party and she was home alone on Orm Avenue in this trailer. Now there's a creek that runs right behind the trailer. And she was on the telephone talking to a friend of hers, and she said she kept getting the feeling that she'd been watched. And I'm not sure what time it was, but it was at night. And she got done talking to her girlfriend, and she went to the kitchen and was going to look out the door, and I think there was a little bit of a window in the back door. And when she looked through the glass, she could see this creature standing out in the driveway under the night light, and it was watching the house, and she could see the eye shine. And it scared her, and she dove behind the couch and assumed a fetal position until her parents came home. But this is either the actual trailer that they lived in or their garage, and down there with the bank is this creek. I'm not sure whether that's, Leatherwood Creek is the name of that creek. So, we think that these animals use the creeks to travel, or, the power line right-of-ways, or under the bridges and the ridge lines. But we think it was coming up the creek, and it possibly just saw the light on up there at the trailer and walked up the bank and was looking in the window. So that was her story. I got an email from this truck driver who was hauling a load of something on his semi. I don't know what he was hauling, but he loaded up in Marietta, Ohio, and was going 77 north towards Cleveland. Well, right in the low area of the interstate around mile marker 52 to 54, right along where the Salt Fork Dam area is, his truck slowed down. He's got this automatic braking system on his cruise control, and he looked up, and this creature was crossing the interstate in front of the rig, and he said he saw it go completely across both lanes of I-77. Now this is, as I said, very, very close to Salt Fork, right by the dam. Tom Pretty. Okay, Tom had a sighting at the Salt Fork group camping area, the bridge, just below there. I read this letter that he wrote to the local newspaper in Cambridge. He had made arrangements with the deer hunters that were staying in the group camping area for the muzzleloader season in the fall. He made an agreement with them to provide firewood with them. So he and his friend took the firewood up, and Tom had often said, we'd always wanted to stop and fish this little creek that you go across the bridge. So after they got the wood unloaded, they come back and parked the truck and got their fishing gear out of the back, and they walked down along the creek, and they found a spot in some of this tall grass. Now this picture was taken obviously in the winter when it was iced over, but this took place in the fall. But they sat in the tall grass and they were rigging up their fishing poles, you know, putting the line up through the guides and tying on their hooks and stuff. They saw something on the other side of the creek moving in the weeds. They said it was dark, but he couldn't tell exactly what it was. He thought maybe it was a beaver or something. Within a few seconds, they saw this head poke out of the weeds, and this creature kind of turned and looked up the creek and then down the creek, and then it emerged completely out of the weeds. It was down on all fours, and it was hair covered, and it had arms and legs, you know, like a person, but it was completely covered with hair. It stuck its face down in that muddy water, started drinking just like a dog would do. It still hadn't seen Tom and his friend sitting in the weeds on the other side. After it drank, it stood up on 2 feet, turned around and started to walk back up the bank. At that point, Tom's companion started to cough. Well, the creature spun around and it spied the 2 men sitting there. It took a step or 2 towards them. Tom stood up thinking the thing was going to come across the creek and get them. And he said, the only thing I had to fight it with was my rod and reel, and I held it over my head thinking, you know, I'll hit it, that's all I've got. Well, he said that the animal stared at him, and then it would stare at the other fella, and then back to Tom. And after it did that for a couple moments, he said that, well, it quit looking away from me, it just stared at me. And then it dropped down on all fours and made a kind of a growl noise and disappeared back up into the brush. Well, Tom's heart was beating a mile a minute, and after he regained his composure somewhat, he turned to say something to his companion, and the man wasn't there. And I said, well, what happened to the guy? He says, well, I grabbed his stuff and started walking back to the truck, and there he sat in my truck up there with the doors locked and the windows rolled up. And I said, well, it's wonder he didn't take off and leave you. He said, well, I had the keys in my pocket. He couldn't get away. But anyway, you know, it shook Tom up so much that he couldn't really, he couldn't get over this, and he, you know, bothered his sleep, and he thought about it all the time, and he thought these things didn't exist, or at least I didn't think they did. And if there was some slim possibility that it was true, that they sure as heck didn't live in Ohio, it was out in British Columbia or California or someplace, but yet there it was, and he saw its, you know, saw the thing drinking the water and saw its eyes blink and its chest raising and lowering where it was breathing, and, you know, so it was real. So he wrote this letter to the editor, and I happened to see the letter and got a hold of him and talked to him in person, had 1 or 2 meetings in person, talked to him on the phone several times. So this is at Salt Fork, right very near the group camping area off Parker Road. This is the story out of my new book, a fellow I call Larry, who lived in Belmont County, Ohio when he grew up. And his dad was a coal miner, and he worked about 20 miles away from the residence. And they never had any problems with Bigfoot until the father worked the night shift. And when Dad left, he would get in the old pickup truck and drive away. And this Bigfoot creature that would come around was smart enough to know that when the truck wasn't there, the father wasn't there. And that's the only time it would come around. And it would do things like, you know, make noises and get the dogs all stirred up, and it would slap on the house. And one night, the mother saw it out close to the barn, and she had, the kids, she had 4 kids, and Larry was one of the 4. She said, "Larry, get the shotgun." So he retrieved the shotgun and put a shell in it for her, and she opened the front door, and she could see this creature out close to the barn, which was next to the house. And she fired a shot in the air over its head, and it took off running down through the brush and the weeds and everything. So after a while, the creature upped its game somewhat and figured out that there was another outside entrance, that it could open up the doors and go down and get into the basement of the house from outside, and it learned how to do that. And one night, the kids were scared to death to begin with when their dad wasn't at home at night when he was at work, and then one night they heard something banging around in the basement and heard it running into furniture and stuff, and they could hear heavy breathing beneath their feet. So Larry was summoned to grab the shotgun again and load it up, and the mother stood there, with the gun pointed at the door, and anytime this would happen, she would call the Belmont County Sheriff's Office, and they would send deputies out, and they could never find the creature, but they were finding tracks, and they knew the woman was telling the truth. And it got to where they'd also call Larry's father, and he would come home too. But the thing ended up under the house, but it didn't climb the stairs and come through the door, but Mama was ready with the old shotgun up, in the kitchen. So we might have time for one more story. Do we have any questions or anything?
Not seeing any. I've got a comment here,
Okay.
but not seeing any questions yet. If anybody does have any,
Okay.
feel free to post them. Or
Let's tell one more story. This is from Tyler Redmond, and Tyler and I became friends after this. He lives down in Hamilton County, down by Cincinnati, and he's a very avid deer hunter, and he learned through investigating online that Coshocton County, Ohio, was one of the best counties in the state for big bucks. So Tyler and a friend had scheduled a trip to come up and camp and hunt, and at the last minute the friend was unable to come, so Tyler came up by himself. And this took place right near Wills Creek Reservoir. And Tyler pitched a tent back out in the woods next to the creek. There was absolutely nothing there, and he didn't even have a campfire. He'd hunted that day. I don't think he saw anything. He had his bow and arrow. He didn't see anything, but he did hear a couple of bucks fighting on the other side of the creek. So that night, as he was in his tent asleep, he woke up because he was cold. And I think this was right around Thanksgiving. So he woke up when he was cold, and he was getting ready to get out of the sleeping bag and light his little heater he had in there. He heard this blood-curdling scream and something stomping past, and it scared him so bad. He said he had chest pains, and his bow, which was the only weapon he had other than his hunting knife, was outside leaning up against the tree, so he had to unzip the tent and go out and get his crossbow. And it was dark out and very foggy, and he could hear this thing stomping off into the blackness, screaming, and he said it absolutely rattled his chest. The scream was so loud. So you've heard the term break camp. That's what Tyler did. He bear hugged the tent and bent the poles and everything, threw everything into his aluminum boat that he pulled up on the shore of the creek. And luckily the motor fire dried up and he was able to get down to the boat ramp. He pulled the boat out, got out of there and drove to Coshocton. This would have been like 2 o'clock in the morning, and got a motel room. And he called his wife, and she posted something online early the next morning, and I happened to see it, so I called him that afternoon and got his story, and it's in my first book, but this was right off of this County Road 410 in Shaw. And there have been other reports from that area.
Wow. Speaking of, you're saying that they posted it online. There's actually a question now. Someone commenting if there is a place you'd recommend where folks could post sightings online.
Yeah, just get a hold of our Southeastern Ohio Society for Bigfoot Investigations page. And we have pictures on there and videos, and they can post things on there. They can ask questions. They can share their story.
Great.
And we'd like to hear from them.
Great. I'll post a link in the comments on this afterward too for folks. So.
So that's really about all I have today. If you're interested in accessing my books, we've got some literature up here. I think you got a picture on how they can get a hold of me. And I'm always looking for stories of people's sightings and encounters. You know, I've written 5 books now, and if I get enough stories, I'll certainly do another book.
So everybody watching or anybody watching after the fact, more stories means more books. So. All right. Well, thank you so much, Doug. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and for presenting. I know it's a little bit different of a presentation. It's a little bit different for us too, and you know, hopefully soon enough we'll be able to have folks actually back in here for a presentation, and you guys would be welcome back too, of course, if you'd ever want to come drive out.
Yeah, we'd like to come back. It's only about an hour and a half.
Oh wow,
for us.
great. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. There will be a video that we're going to throw up on the library YouTube channel as well later for anybody who's watching or wants to watch later. We'll save this too for anybody to watch later. And thank you so much again, Doug and Shauna, for coming out. And guess digital round of applause for you all.